The transport ship Galactic Unity hummed through the void between star systems, carrying diplomatic envoys from 12 different species to the Consortium Peace Summit on Nexus Prime. Ambassador Chun Wei sat in the human delegation's quarters, reviewing trade agreements on his tablet while his colleagues prepared for the meetings ahead. The ship's artificial gravity made the 3-day journey comfortable, though Chun always felt the subtle wrongness of manufactured gravity compared to Earth's natural pull. Chun had served as Earth's primary ambassador for 15 years, ever since humanity joined the Galactic Consortium. He was known throughout diplomatic circles for his patience, his careful words, and his ability to find common ground between species that had been enemies for centuries. The other ambassadors respected him. They trusted him. They saw him as one of the more reasonable apex species representatives. They had no idea what they were really looking at. The door chimed softly, and Chun looked up to see Ambassador Crix, the Zephyrian delegation leader, entering with her usual graceful movements. The Zephyrians were tall, slender beings with crystalline skin that shifted colors based on their emotions. Right now, Crix's skin showed the soft blue of friendship and respect. Ambassador Chun, Crix said in her musical voice, each word carefully pronounced in galactic standard. I wanted to discuss the mining rights proposal before we reach Nexus Prime. Chun smiled warmly and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Of course, Ambassador Crix. Please sit. Would you like some tea? I have a blend from Earth that many species find pleasant. As Crix settled into the chair, her skin shifted to a pleased green. That would be lovely, thank you. Chun moved to the small food preparation unit in the corner of his quarters and began preparing the tea. His movements were calm, practiced, and entirely human in their efficiency. I've been reviewing the Andromeda sector mining proposal, he said, keeping his tone conversational. The hegemony's demands seem ambitious. That's a diplomatic way of putting it, Crix replied, her skin flickering briefly to an annoyed orange before returning to green. The Vrex want exclusive access to 4 entire systems. They claim it's for peaceful resource extraction, but their military buildup suggests otherwise. Chun poured the tea into 2 cups, the fragrant steam rising between them. He handed 1 cup to Crix, noting how carefully she held it with her long, delicate fingers. The Vrex have always been direct in their approach to expansion, he said. But I believe we can find a compromise that satisfies their need for resources while maintaining system security for the smaller species. Crix sipped her tea, her skin brightening with pleasure. You always find a way to make the impossible seem reasonable, Ambassador Chun. I sometimes wonder how humans developed such diplomatic skills. Your species is so young compared to most of ours, yet you navigate our politics better than races that have been spacefaring for millennia. Chen's smile never wavered, but something cold moved behind his eyes for just a moment. We learned early that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict, he said, though I suppose every species has had to learn that lesson in their own way. Indeed, Crix agreed, though some species seem to learn it more easily than others. The Vrex, for instance, still believe that strength alone determines rightful ownership. Strength has its place, Chun said carefully, returning to his seat. But lasting peace requires understanding. The Vrex respect power? Yes, but they also respect results. If we can show them that cooperative mining yields better long-term profits than territorial conquest, they'll listen. Crix's skin shifted thoughtfully between green and blue. You sound almost like you admire their directness. Understand it, Chun corrected gently. The Vrex don't hide their intentions behind layers of diplomatic language. When they want something, they say so. When they're willing to fight for it, they make that clear too. There's a certain honesty in that approach. Before Crix could respond, the ship's communication system activated. All ambassadors to the observation deck for the approach briefing. Came the captain's voice, a steady rumble that belonged to Captain Thane, one of the massive Corellian species. Crix finished her tea and stood gracefully. Shall we? Chun nodded and collected his tablet. Together, they made their way through the ship's corridors toward the observation deck. The Galactic Unity was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built by 7 different species working together. The corridors were wide enough for the largest species, while still feeling comfortable for smaller ones like humans. The lighting could be adjusted for different visual spectrums, and the air recycling system maintained atmosphere preferences for all aboard. As they walked, Chun found himself studying Crix's movements. The Zephyrians were graceful by nature, but there was something almost dance-like in how she moved through the ship. Every step was precise, elegant, economical. He wondered if she had ever seen real combat, if that grace would hold under pressure. The observation deck held representatives from all 12 species aboard the ship. The Vrex delegation stood together near one wall, their massive frames and dark scales making them look like living armor. The ethereals floated near the ceiling, their translucent forms barely visible except for the soft glow they emitted. The Croelians dominated one corner, their rock-like skin and enormous eyes making the deck feel smaller than it was. Captain Thane, a Croelian himself, stood at the center of the room beside a holographic display showing their destination. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, he began in his deep voice. We are approaching Nexus Prime. As you can see, the station is impressive. The hologram showed a massive space station, easily the size of a small moon. It rotated slowly, its surface covered in docking bays, cities, and defensive installations. Hundreds of ships moved around it like insects around a hive. Nexus Prime houses over 50 million beings from 93 different species, Captain Thane continued. It serves as neutral territory for diplomatic meetings, trade negotiations, and cultural exchanges. Security is provided jointly by the Consortium Defense Force, with representatives from 26 different species. Ambassador Vrex, leader of the Vrex delegation, stepped forward. His voice was like grinding stone when he spoke. What is the security rating for this summit? Level 7, Captain Thane replied. All weapons will be scanned and stored upon arrival. Personal protection devices are limited to defensive shields and communication implants. Any aggressive action will result in immediate detention by station security. Shin noted how several species relaxed at this news, while others seemed mildly annoyed. The Vrex delegation looked particularly displeased. They were warriors by nature and rarely felt comfortable without their weapons. The summit itself will take place in the Central Diplomatic Complex, Captain Thane continued. Sessions will be broadcast live throughout Consortium space, as per standard protocol for major treaty negotiations. The mining rights agreement under discussion affects 17 different systems and involves 29 species, so galactic attention will be significant. Ambassador Whisper, one of the ethereal delegates, spoke in their characteristic soft voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Are there any security concerns we should be aware of? Captain Thane's expression grew slightly more serious. There have been some minor protests on the outer ring of the station. Several smaller species are concerned that the mining agreement favors apex species over their territorial claims. Station security assures me these protests are peaceful and will not interfere with the summit. Chun felt that familiar cold stirring in his chest. Protests. Smaller species feeling overlooked and powerless. It was a scenario he had seen play out before, across dozens of worlds and hundreds of negotiations. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak protested until they were ignored into silence. How are these protests being handled? He asked, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned diplomacy. Peaceful demonstration zones have been established in the commercial district, Captain Thane replied. Station security is monitoring the situation closely. The protesters have been cooperative so far. Ambassador Crix's skin shifted to a worried yellow. I hope their concerns can be addressed through proper diplomatic channels. Peaceful species deserve to have their voices heard. Of course, agreed Ambassador VYSS, leader of the Serpentine delegation. Her scales rippled in what passed for a nod among her species. The whole purpose of the consortium is to protect the rights of all member species, regardless of size or military strength. Chen nodded along with the others, making appropriate diplomatic sounds of agreement. Inside, however, he was thinking about the mathematics of power. 29 species involved in the mining agreement, 17 star systems, hundreds of worlds, trillions of beings whose lives would be affected by decisions made in comfortable rooms by people who would never set foot on those worlds. And somewhere on that station ahead of them, smaller species were protesting because they knew how these negotiations always ended. The apex species would divide the resources among themselves, throw a few token concessions to the mid-tier powers, and the smallest species would be left to accept whatever scraps remained. It was the way things had always been, would always be. The strong ruled. The weak survived by the grace of the strong. And everyone pretended it was diplomacy. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered the station's docking approach. Through the observation windows, Chun could see the massive structure growing larger, its surface details becoming visible. Cities sparkled with lights from 100 different species. Ships moved in carefully controlled patterns, guided by traffic control systems that managed thousands of arrivals and departures every day. Docking in 30 minutes, Captain Thane announced. All delegates should return to their quarters and prepare for arrival processing. Welcome to Nexus Prime. As the group began to disperse, Chun found himself walking beside Ambassador Crix again. Her skin had returned to its usual blue-green of contentment, but he could sense the underlying tension in her movements. Nervous about the summit? He asked gently. A little, she admitted. These mining agreements can become quite contentious. My people have claims in 3 of the affected systems. Nothing major, just some research stations and a few small colonies, but you're worried about being overlooked in favor of species that can bring more military pressure to bear, Chin finished for her. Crix's skin flashed surprise orange for a moment. Ah, yes, exactly. How did you know? Chin smiled his diplomat smile. Because that's how these things always work, Ambassador. The question isn't whether the apex species will get the lion's share of the resources. The question is how much they're willing to share to keep everyone else quiet. That's rather cynical for a human, Crix said, her skin shifting to confused purple. Is it? Chin asked. Or is it realistic? Tell me, in all your years of diplomacy, how many times have you seen a major resource agreement that didn't primarily benefit the species with the largest fleets and the strongest economies? Crix was quiet for a long moment, her skin cycling through several colors as she considered the question. Finally, she said, You make it sound hopeless. Not hopeless, Chin said. Just predictable. The key is making sure that the predictable outcome is one you can live with. The Zephyrians are skilled negotiators. Your people will find a way to protect what matters most to you. They had reached Crix's quarters. She paused at the door, her skin a thoughtful blue-green. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if the smaller species simply refused to participate in these negotiations. If we just said no to the apex species and their divide and conquer tactics. Chun felt that cold stirring again, stronger this time. That would be unwise, Ambassador. The apex species didn't become apex species by accepting no gracefully. Better to work within the system than to challenge it directly. Spoken like a true apex species representative, Crix said, but there was no accusation in her tone, just tired resignation. Perhaps, Chun said, but also spoken like someone who has seen what happens when diplomacy fails. Good luck at the summit, Ambassador. I'll look forward to working with you. Crix's skin shifted to a warm, grateful green. Thank you, Ambassador Chun. Your tea was lovely, and your company was even better. I hope we can find a solution that works for everyone. Chun watched her enter her quarters, then continued on to his own. As he walked, he thought about her words. A solution that works for everyone. Such a pleasant diplomatic fiction. In all his years of negotiations, he had never once seen a solution that truly worked for everyone. There were always winners and losers. The art of diplomacy was simply in making the losing more palatable. Back in his quarters, Chun locked the door and activated the privacy shield. Then he moved to his personal safe and withdrew a small, unremarkable device that looked like a standard communication implant. But this device had capabilities that would have horrified his diplomatic colleagues. He pressed it behind his ear and felt the familiar tingle as it connected to his nervous system. Immediately, his awareness expanded. He could sense the ship around him, the electromagnetic signatures of every being aboard, the subtle stress patterns in the hull, the energy flows through the ship's systems. For just a moment, Chen allowed himself to feel what lay beneath the diplomatic mask. The calculations came automatically now, after so many years of practice. The Zephyrians had a defense fleet of perhaps 200 ships, mostly converted civilian vessels. The Ethereals had advanced technology, but refused to use it for warfare. The Serpentines had decent numbers, but lacked coordination. Any one of the apex species could conquer all three of them within a standard month. The Vrex could do it in half that time. And humanity? Humanity could do it in a week. But that was not the human way. Humans had learned long ago that conquest created rebels, and rebels created problems. Much better to let the smaller species keep their dignity, their autonomy, their belief that they were partners rather than subjects. Much better to take what you needed through negotiation, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts. Much better to wear the mask. Chun deactivated the device and returned it to the safe. When he turned back to his desk, his expression had returned to the calm, patient demeanor of a career diplomat. He had work to do, agreements to review, and a summit to prepare for. Outside his window, Nexus Prime continued to grow larger, its lights beckoning like a promise of peace and cooperation between species. It was beautiful in its way, a monument to what civilized beings could accomplish when they worked together. It was also a perfect example of apex species control masquerading as democracy. The station had been built primarily by human, Vrex, and Corellian resources. The smaller species had contributed what they could, but their contributions were token compared to what the big three had invested. In return, the smaller species got to participate in governance, to have their voices heard, to feel like partners in galactic civilization. And in exchange for that feeling, they accepted a system where the real power remained exactly where it had always been. With those strong enough to take what they wanted, wise enough to let everyone else think they had a choice. The docking alarm sounded, and Chun felt the ship settle into its berth. Soon, he would disembark and take his place among the galaxy's diplomatic elite. He would smile, negotiate, find compromises, and help forge agreements that would benefit humanity while leaving everyone else feeling like they had gotten a fair deal. It was what he was good at, what humans as a species had become exceptionally good at. And if sometimes smaller species asked uncomfortable questions, if they wondered why the apex species always seemed to come out ahead despite all the talk of equality and cooperation, well, that was simply the way of things. After all, someone had to be in charge. Someone had to make the hard decisions. Someone had to ensure that galactic civilization continued to function, even if that meant some species got more than others. Humans had simply proven themselves very good at being those someones. Chun gathered his materials and prepared to disembark. The summit would begin in 6 hours, and he had preparations to make, deals to arrange, concessions to negotiate, and smaller species to convince that they were getting everything they could reasonably expect. It was just another day in the life of a human diplomat, just another day of wearing the mask. The central diplomatic complex of Nexus Prime was a marvel of architectural cooperation, with chambers designed to accommodate the biological needs of nearly 100 different species. The main negotiation hall featured adjustable gravity fields, variable atmospheric controls, and seating arrangements that could adapt to everything from the floating ethereals to the massive Corellians. The lighting could shift across multiple spectrums, and the translation systems were so advanced they could convey not just words but emotional context across dozens of different communication methods. Ambassador Chunwei sat at the human delegations table. reviewing his notes while the hall filled with representatives from across the galaxy. The Mining Rights Summit had drawn attention from far beyond the 29 species directly involved. Observer delegations from minor species, trade unions, and even some planetary governments had requested permission to attend. The consortium had granted most of these requests, partly out of diplomatic courtesy and partly because public negotiations were harder to later dispute. Everything said in this hall would be recorded, transmitted across the galaxy, and analyzed by billions of beings with interests in how the Andromeda sector resources were divided. Chun found himself studying the observer sections with particular interest. There, in a cluster of seats designed for smaller species, sat delegations from 12 different worlds that had no direct stake in a mining agreement, but had requested permission to witness the negotiations. Their species' names were barely pronounceable in Galactic Standard. The Zixhai, the Nthorian Collective, the Umbriel Commonwealth, others whose civilizations were measured in thousands rather than millions of years. They were here to learn, Chun knew, to observe how apex species conducted their business, to see if the promises of equality and mutual respect that filled consortium propaganda had any basis in reality. They were about to be disappointed. The session will begin in 15 minutes, announced the hall's AI system in perfectly modulated Galactic Standard. All representatives, please take your designated positions. Chin looked across the hall to where the Vrex delegation was settling into their specially reinforced seating. Ambassador Vrex himself was a mountain of scar-black scales and artificial limbs, a veteran of the border wars who had transitioned to diplomacy after losing his left arm to hegemony plasma fire. Despite his diplomatic title, everything about Vrex screamed soldier. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone always ready for violence, and his small red eyes missed nothing. Next to the Vrex sat the Croelian delegation, their massive rocky frames making their section of the hall look like a geological formation. Ambassador Slate was their leader, an ancient being whose weathered skin told the story of centuries spent in vacuum and under alien suns. The Croelians were perhaps the oldest spacefaring species in the consortium, and their approach to diplomacy was as patient and methodical as continental drift. The ethereal delegation floated in their designated space near the hall's ceiling, their translucent forms barely visible except for the soft bioluminescence that pulsed along their edges. They communicated through harmonic vibrations that the translation system converted to speech, giving their words an otherworldly quality that many species found either beautiful or deeply unsettling. Chen's attention was drawn to a commotion in the observer section. A small delegation of beings that looked vaguely reptilian, but moved with quick, nervous energy, was having what appeared to be an animated discussion. Their translator was gesturing frantically, clearly struggling with some aspect of protocol. "The Kesh Tai," said a voice beside Chun. He turned to see Dr. Sarah Martinez, the human delegation's chief economist, settling into the seat next to his. They're one of the species with territorial claims that overlap the Andromedas mining zones. They've never participated in a consortium-level negotiation before. "Nervous?" Chun asked. "Terrified would be more accurate," Sarah replied, opening her tablet and scrolling through economic projections. Their entire civilization has a population smaller than New Geneva. They're convinced this summit will result in them being forcibly relocated from their homeworld. Chin watched the Keshtai delegation for a moment longer. Their fear was palpable even across the species barrier. They kept looking around the hall like small animals surrounded by predators, which, Chun supposed, was exactly what they were. "Will it?" he asked Sarah quietly. "Will what? Will they be forcibly relocated?" Sarah paused in her scrolling and looked at him with surprise. "Of course not. Their homeworld isn't even suitable for the type of mining being proposed. Their main population centers are nowhere near the extraction sites. But their territories are. Well, yes, some of their outer territories might need to be reorganized, but they'll receive compensation, relocation assistance, technology transfers. Standard protocol for development displacement." Shin nodded slowly. Standard protocol. Such clean language for the process of removing inconvenient populations from valuable resources. The consortium had developed quite an elegant system over the centuries. No one was ever conquered or displaced. They were relocated, compensated, assisted in finding new opportunities. And if they refused the assistance, if they insisted on staying on worlds that happened to contain resources that apex species needed, well, there were protocols for that too. The session will now begin, announced the AI. All beings please observe proper diplomatic courtesy. The floor recognizes Consortium Mediator Prime. A figure rose from the central mediator's platform. Prime was a synthetic, one of the artificial beings that served as neutral parties in major negotiations. Their crystalline form caught and refracted the hall's light, creating shifting patterns that somehow managed to be both beautiful and completely alien. Synthetics were trusted specifically because they had no species loyalty, no biological drives, no cultural preferences that might bias their decisions. Of course, they have been created by the apex species, programmed by the apex species, and maintained by the apex species. But everyone pretended they were truly neutral. Honored delegates, Prime began, their voice carrying clearly throughout the hall without need for amplification. We gather today to negotiate the development rights for the Andromeda Sector Mining Initiative. This project represents one of the largest resource development efforts in consortium history, with potential benefits for hundreds of worlds and billions of beings. Prime gestured, and a massive holographic display materialized above the central platform. It showed the Andromeda sector in detail. 17 star systems containing 43 worlds, dozens of asteroid belts, and some of the richest mineral deposits ever discovered outside the galactic core. The total estimated value of extractable resources exceeds 100 trillion consortium credits, Prime continued. Development will require significant infrastructure investment, advanced extraction technology, and careful environmental management to ensure the long-term sustainability of the affected systems. Chun studied the display while Prime spoke. The systems were beautiful in the abstract, rendered in clean lines and soft colors that made them look like art rather than real places where real beings lived real lives. The hologram showed the proposed extraction sites, the planned shipping routes, the locations where processing stations would be built. What it didn't show were the colonies, research stations, mining outposts, and small settlements that would be in the way of those developments. Those were relegated to a separate data layer that had to be specifically requested to view. The primary stakeholders in this development are as follows, Prime announced, and names began appearing next to different systems. The Vrex hegemony has historical claims to systems 4, 7, 11, and 16. The Croelian Collective has established mining operations in systems 1, 8, and 13. The Human Colonial Administration has active settlements in systems 3, 9, 12, and 15. Should notice that between them, the three apex species had claims that covered nearly every major resource deposit in the sector. What a convenient coincidence. Secondary stakeholders include the Zephyrian Republic, with research installations in systems 5 and 10. The Ethereal Communion maintains observation posts in systems 2 and 6. The Serpentine Alliance has trading stations in systems 14 and 17. Still valuable territories, but notably lacking the richest deposits. The secondary powers would get to keep their existing installations, probably even see them upgraded as part of the development deal. In exchange, they would provide support for the larger extraction efforts run by the apex species. Tertiary stakeholders include 37 smaller species with various territorial claims throughout the sector. 37 species reduced to a single line item. Chin could see representatives from some of those species in the observer section, their expressions ranging from hopeful to resigned to quietly desperate. Prime continued the opening presentation, outlining the legal framework for the negotiations, the environmental protection standards that would be implemented, the economic benefit sharing formulas that had been proposed. It was all very thorough, very professional, very carefully designed to make the entire process look fair and transparent. Chen had seen variations of this presentation dozens of times over the years. The details changed, but the structure was always the same. The apex species had already worked out the broad strokes of the deal in private negotiations months ago. This public summit was essentially a ratification ceremony, with enough genuine discussion to make the smaller species feel like they were participating in the decision-making process. When Prime finished the presentation and called for opening statements, Ambassador Vrex was the first to rise. His massive frame dominated the hall as he stepped to the speaking platform. The Vrex hegemony is pleased to participate in this development initiative. He began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Our species has extensive experience with large-scale resource extraction, and our industrial capacity is uniquely suited to the challenges of the Andromeda sector. He gestured at the holographic display, and several sections highlighted in red. We are prepared to commit 45 heavy extraction fleets, 30 industrial processing platforms, and 200 support vessels to this project. Our projected investment exceeds 20 trillion credits over the first phase of development. Chun noted the precision of those numbers. Vrex had clearly done extensive planning before this summit. The hegemony wasn't just expressing interest. They were laying down a marker that said they expected to be the primary development partner. In exchange, Vrex continued, we require guaranteed access to systems 4, 7, 11, and 16 with exclusive extraction rights in the primary mineral belts. We are willing to discuss joint development partnerships with qualified species, provided they can demonstrate comparable technological and industrial capacity. The qualifier at the end was significant. Comparable technological and industrial capacity effectively eliminated every species in the hall except humans and Croelians. It was a polite way of saying that the Vrex expected to work with their fellow apex powers while the smaller species provided support services and got out of the way. Ambassador Slate rose next, moving with the slow deliberation typical of Croelians. When he spoke, his voice had the patience of geological time. The Croelian collective approaches this development with our characteristic long-term perspective. He began. We have been extracting resources from the Andromeda sector for over 400 standard years. Our operations there are sustainable, efficient, and environmentally responsible. Chun translated this in his head. We were there first, we're not going anywhere, and we've been doing this longer than some of your species have been spacefaring. We propose expanding our existing operations while maintaining our proven environmental standards, Slate continued. The collective is prepared to share our accumulated knowledge of the sector's unique geological challenges with all development partners. We seek confirmation of our historical rights to Systems 1, 8, and 13, with consideration for expanded operations in adjacent territories as development proceeds. The Croelian approach was subtly different from the Vrex position. Where Vrex was aggressive and direct, Slate emphasized stability, experience, and environmental responsibility. The Croelians were positioning themselves as the reliable, steady partners who would keep the extraction operations running smoothly for centuries to come. Chen rose when his turn came, smoothing his diplomatic robes as he approached the speaking platform. The hall's attention focused on him, and he could feel the weight of dozens of different species watching to see what humanity's position would be. The Human Colonial Administration approaches this development opportunity with our species' commitment to cooperative prosperity. He began, using the standard opening that had served him well in dozens of negotiations. Humanity brings advanced extraction technology, efficient logistics networks, and extensive experience in multi-species project coordination. He paused and looked around the hall, making eye contact with representatives from various species. It was a technique he had perfected over years of diplomatic service, making everyone feel like he was speaking directly to them, like their concerns were personally important to him. We propose a development model that maximizes benefits for all participants, Chun continued. Human industrial capacity can provide technological support for smaller species who wish to participate in extraction operations. Our colonial infrastructure can offer logistics coordination for the transportation and processing of extracted materials. And our financial institutions can provide development funding for species that need assistance with initial capital investments. Chun could see the smaller species representatives leaning forward with interest. This was what they wanted to hear: opportunities for participation, technological assistance, financial support. The promise that they wouldn't be left out of the potential profits. Of course, what Chun didn't mention was that technological assistance came with licensing fees, logistics coordination required long-term exclusive contracts, and development funding came with interest rates and repayment terms that effectively made the borrowing species junior partners in their own resource extraction. But those details could be worked out in the fine print. Humanity seeks confirmation of our development rights in Systems 3, 9, 12, and 15, Chun concluded. We look forward to working with all species represented here to create a development framework that serves the interests of galactic prosperity and interspecies cooperation. When Chun returned to his seat, he could see the pattern beginning to emerge. The three apex species had laid out their core positions, and now the secondary powers would respond. They would express support for the General Development Initiative while seeking to secure the best possible terms for their own interests. The smaller species would be heard last, and their requests would be carefully noted, diplomatically acknowledged, and then largely ignored in favor of what the apex powers had already decided. But first, they would all go through the ritual of pretending this was a genuine negotiation where every voice mattered equally. Ambassador Crix rose gracefully from the Zephyrian delegation's table. Her crystalline skin was a calm blue-green, but Chun could detect the subtle tension in her posture that suggested she was less composed than she appeared. The Zephyrian Republic appreciates the opportunity to participate in this historic development initiative, she began, her musical voice carrying well through the hall's acoustics. Our research installations in Systems 5 and 10 have provided valuable scientific data about the sector's unique properties for over 2 centuries. Chun admired her opening. By emphasizing their research contributions, Crix was establishing Zephyrian legitimacy in the sector while positioning her people as valuable partners rather than obstacles to development. We propose expanding our research operations in conjunction with the extraction activities, Crix continued. Zephyrian science can provide ongoing environmental monitoring, geological analysis, and sustainability assessments to ensure that development proceeds responsibly. We request guaranteed access to our existing research sites and consideration for establishing new facilities as extraction operations expand. It was a clever position. The Zephyrians couldn't compete with apex species in terms of industrial capacity, but they could position themselves as essential support partners. Environmental monitoring and sustainability assessment were becoming increasingly important in consortium law, and having Zephyrian scientists providing those services would give the development initiative credibility with smaller species who might otherwise question its environmental impact. The ethereal delegation's response came as a harmonic vibration that the translation system converted to speech. The ethereal communion observes with interest the potential for this development to advance interspecies cooperation and understanding. Our observation posts in Systems 2 and 6 have provided unique perspectives on the sector's temporal dynamics and energy flows. Chun suppressed a smile. The ethereals were the only species in the consortium that could make resource extraction sound like a spiritual experience. Their observation posts were actually sophisticated monitoring stations that tracked energy patterns throughout the sector, but the ethereals insisted on describing them in terms that made them sound like meditation retreats. We propose contributing our unique sensor technologies to the development effort, the ethereal delegate continued. Ethereal energy flow monitoring can optimize extraction efficiency while minimizing disruption to the sector's natural harmonic balance. We seek assurance that our observation posts will be maintained and that development activities will respect the sector's inherent energy patterns. The Serpentine delegation spoke last among the secondary powers. Ambassador VSS approached the platform with the sinuous grace of her species, her scales rippling with patterns that indicated calm confidence. The Serpentine Alliance has maintained profitable trading operations throughout the Andromeda sector for over 3 centuries, she said, her forked tongue flickering slightly as she spoke. Our trading stations in Systems 14 and 17 serve as commercial hubs for over 20 different species throughout the region. VYSS was playing to the Serpentine reputation as the galaxy's most skilled traders. By emphasizing their commercial networks and their service to multiple species, she was positioning the Alliance as an essential partner for managing the economic aspects of the development. We propose expanding our trading operations to support the development initiative, VYSS continued. Serpentine commercial networks can facilitate resource distribution, manage currency exchanges, and provide market analysis to maximize the economic benefits for all participants. We request confirmation of our trading rights throughout the sector and consideration for establishing additional commercial facilities as extraction operations expand. Shin nodded approvingly. The secondary powers had all positioned themselves well. They had accepted the reality that the apex species would control the major extraction operations, but they had carved out valuable supporting roles that would ensure their continued relevance and profitability. Now came the part of the negotiations that Shin always found most interesting. Listening to the smaller species try to secure some small piece of the enormous pie that was about to be divided. The first speaker from the tertiary stakeholders was a representative of the Keshtai, the nervous reptilian species that Shun had noticed earlier. Their translator's voice shook slightly as they spoke. The Keshtai Confederation humbly requests consideration for our territorial claims in the outer regions of System 12, they said. Our colonies have existed there for over 50 standard years. We seek assurance that our people will not be displaced by extraction activities. System 12. Shun consulted his tablet quickly and confirmed what he had suspected. The Keshtai colonies were located directly on top of one of the richest mineral deposits in the entire sector. Their displacement was virtually guaranteed. But not yet. Not in this forum. Here, their request would be noted with appropriate diplomatic gravity, and promises would be made to work with them to find a solution that met everyone's needs. Other small species representatives followed, each making similar requests. The Thraxian Collective wanted their asteroid mining operations protected. The Velhai Empire requested access to new territories to compensate for lands that would be affected by development. The Zixhai Federation asked for technology transfers to help them participate in extraction activities. Chun listened to each request with his diplomat's face, nodding at appropriate moments, making notes on his tablet, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed he was taking their concerns seriously. Inside, however, he was making different calculations. The Thraxians were strip-mining asteroids using techniques that the Croelians could do better and more efficiently. The Velhai had no industrial capacity worth mentioning. The Zixhai Federation represented exactly 47 inhabited worlds with a combined population smaller than Earth's smallest continent. None of them had anything to offer that the apex species needed. None of them had the military strength to enforce their territorial claims, if those claims conflicted with apex species interests. None of them were essential partners in the kind of massive industrial undertaking that the Andromeda sector development represented. They were obstacles to be managed, not partners to be negotiated with. But they had to be managed carefully. The consortium's legitimacy depended on maintaining the fiction that all species were equal partners in galactic civilization. These smaller species couldn't be simply swept aside. They had to be convinced that they were being treated fairly, that their interests were being considered, that the final agreement was the result of genuine multilateral negotiation. It was delicate work. Chen had spent years perfecting the techniques required to make species accept their own marginalization while feeling grateful for the opportunity. As the smaller species finished their opening statements, Prime called for a recess before the detailed negotiations would begin. Chen gathered his materials and prepared to leave the hall, but his attention was caught by movement in the observer section. A small figure was standing near the section reserved for the smallest species, apparently trying to get the attention of one of the hall's staff members. The being was tiny even by the standards of the microspecies, probably no bigger than a human child, with soft fur and large eyes that seemed to take in everything around them with intense curiosity. Chun consulted his tablet and found the entry, Vesai, a species he had never heard of, representing a single world with a population that barely qualified them for consortium membership. They were listed as observers only, with no territorial claims in the Andromeda sector. So why were they here? The small figure finally succeeded in getting a staff member's attention and was escorted toward the exit. As they passed near Chen's table, he caught a fragment of their conversation with the staff member. "Just want to understand why," came a young voice, filled with the kind of innocent curiosity that Chun hadn't heard in a diplomatic setting for longer than he could remember. The apex species always seemed to get what they want, while everyone else. Chun didn't catch the rest of the exchange as they moved past, but the question lingered in his mind as he made his way toward the exit. Why indeed? The diplomatic reception held that evening in the grand ballroom of Nexus Prime was a carefully orchestrated display of interspecies cooperation. The vast space accommodated beings from across the galaxy, with environmental controls that could shift between different atmosphere preferences and gravity fields that adjusted to accommodate everything from the floating ethereals to species that required heavy world conditions. Ambassador Chun Wei moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his diplomatic smile never wavering as he engaged in the ritual of reception networking. A word here with a Corellian trade minister about shipping logistics, a moment there with a Zephyrian scientist discussing environmental protocols, a brief conversation with a Serpentine merchant about currency stabilization. These receptions served multiple purposes beyond simple socializing. They were opportunities for informal negotiations, for reading the political currents that didn't show up in official statements, and for building the personal relationships that often determined how formal negotiations actually played out. Chun was particularly interested in observing how the smaller species were handling their first exposure to apex-level diplomacy. Many of them had never participated in consortium negotiations of this scale, and their reactions could provide useful insights into how to manage their expectations going forward. He was making his way toward the ethereal delegation when he noticed a small commotion near one of the side alcoves. A group of beings from various smaller species had gathered around what appeared to be a central figure, though Chin couldn't see who it was from his current position. Curiosity piqued, Chin altered his course and approached the group. As he drew closer, he could hear animated conversation in several different languages, with the universal translators working overtime to keep up with the multilingual discussion. Never seen anything like the documentation requirements they're demanding from us, one voice was saying in the clicking tones of the Thraxian language. They want complete geological surveys of territories we've held for centuries, as if our own mining operations weren't proof enough of our legitimate claims. "At least you have mining operations," replied another voice in the melodic tones of a species Chun didn't immediately recognize. "They've informed us that our cultural sites don't constitute valid territorial claims under consortium resource development law. Apparently, the fact that we've maintained sacred places on those worlds for over 1,000 years is legally irrelevant." Chen moved closer, pretending to examine one of the decorative sculptures that dotted the ballroom while listening to the conversation. This kind of informal intelligence gathering was invaluable for understanding how the smaller species were processing the negotiation framework. "The compensation formulas are deliberately incomprehensible," said a third voice, this one belonging to what sounded like a young being whose translator was struggling with emotional inflection. "I've been through the documentation 3 times, and I still can't understand how they calculate fair market value for territories that have never been developed according to consortium standards. Because they don't want us to understand, came a response in the distinctive tones of a Keshtai. The formulas are designed to sound fair, while ensuring that any compensation we receive is minimal compared to the actual value of what we're losing. Chen frowned slightly. This conversation was veering into territory that could become problematic if it continued in public. Small species representatives expressing doubts about consortium negotiation practices could attract unwanted attention from media sources, or worse, inspire other species to start questioning the frameworks they had already accepted. He was about to move away and alert security to monitor the situation when the group shifted slightly, and Chun finally saw who was at the center of the discussion. It was the small, fur-covered being he had noticed earlier in the observation section. Up close, Chun could see that they appeared to be quite young, with the kind of intense, curious eyes that suggested an active and questioning mind. Their species designation, according to Chen's mental files, was HFY. I still don't understand why the apex species get to determine the rules for everyone else, the young being was saying, their translated voice carrying a note of genuine puzzlement rather than anger or resentment. If the consortium is supposed to represent all species equally, why do humans, Vrex, and Croelians always seem to end up with the largest shares of any resource agreement? The question hung in the air for a moment, and Chun could see the other beings in the group exchanging glances. It was the kind of question that everyone thought, but no one asked directly, particularly not in a public setting where their words might be recorded and analyzed. One of the older beings, Thraxian by the look of their carapace patterns, spoke carefully. The apex species have larger populations, more advanced technology, greater industrial capacity. It's only natural that they would receive proportionally larger shares of development rights. But proportional to what? The young HFY pressed. If it's proportional to population, then the ethereal should receive much less than they do, because there are fewer of them than almost any other spacefaring species. If it's proportional to need, then species like mine should receive more, because we have far fewer resources to begin with. If it's proportional to contribution, then why do species that discover resources get smaller shares than species that extract them? Chen found himself genuinely intrigued by the questions. In all his years of diplomatic service, he couldn't recall encountering a being who approached consortium resource allocation with such systematic logical analysis. Most species either accepted the existing frameworks or complained about their specific circumstances, but this young being was questioning the fundamental assumptions that underlay the entire system. It was refreshing and potentially dangerous. The system is complex, replied a being that Chen identified as belonging to the Velhai Empire. There are historical factors, technological considerations, economic realities that all contribute to how resources are allocated. The consortium mediators take all of these factors into account when developing framework agreements. I've read the consortium mediation protocols, the young HFY said matter-of-factly. They're publicly available documents. The weighting formulas for historical claims, technological contribution, and economic capacity are all clearly defined. But when you apply those formulas to actual resource agreements from the past 50 years, the results don't match the actual allocations that were negotiated. Several beings in the group shifted uncomfortably. Shin realized that this young being had actually done the mathematical analysis that most species simply assumed someone else had verified. "What do you mean?" asked the Thraxian. "I mean, the math doesn't work," the young HFY said simply. According to the official formulas, smaller species should receive significantly larger allocations than they actually get in practice. The difference is made up by diplomatic adjustment factors that are never clearly explained in the final agreements. Chun felt a familiar cold sensation in his chest. This was exactly the kind of analysis that the consortium worked very hard to prevent. The official allocation formulas were deliberately complex specifically to discourage this kind of systematic review. Most species lacked either the mathematical sophistication or the bureaucratic patience to work through the calculations themselves. But apparently, at least one young being had both the curiosity and the capability to see through the carefully constructed illusion of mathematical fairness. Maybe, said another voice cautiously, the diplomatic adjustments account for factors that aren't captured in the basic formulas. Security considerations, administrative efficiency, long-term stability. Maybe, the young Vesai agreed. Or maybe the apex species use their political and military advantages to negotiate better terms than the official formulas would justify, and the diplomatic adjustments are just a way to make the final numbers look legitimate. The group fell silent. It was one thing to complain about unfair treatment or to express frustration with complex negotiations. It was quite another to explicitly suggest that the consortium's allocation system was systematically biased in favor of the apex species. Chen realized he had heard enough. This conversation needed to be redirected before it attracted the wrong kind of attention. He stepped forward with his most diplomatic smile. "Excuse me," he said pleasantly, causing the group to turn in his direction. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. I'm Ambassador Chun Wei, representing the Human Colonial Administration. I believe you were discussing the resource allocation frameworks." The group's reaction was immediate and telling. Most of the beings stepped back slightly, their body language shifting to more formal postures. The Thraxian's carapace darkened in what Chen recognized as embarrassment or anxiety. The Velhai representative scales shifted to neutral gray patterns. Only the young Veshai seemed unaffected by Chen's presence. They looked up at him with those large, curious eyes and said, "Yes, Ambassador. I was trying to understand why the mathematical formulas in the consortium protocols don't seem to match the actual resource allocations in historical agreements." Chen maintained his smile while quickly assessing the situation. The other beings in the group clearly understood the potential implications of their discussion being overheard by an apex species representative. They would likely end the conversation quickly and disperse, leaving Chun to deal with the young Veshai privately. "That's a very sophisticated question," Chun said, his tone conveying both approval and gentle condescension. "Resource allocation mathematics can be quite complex, particularly when dealing with multi-species agreements that span multiple economic sectors. Perhaps I could help clarify some of the factors that might not be immediately obvious from the documentation." "That would be very helpful," the young Veshai said, apparently oblivious to the diplomatic subtleties of the interaction. "I'm Kess, representing the Veshai Collective. This is my first major consortium negotiation, so I'm still learning how these processes work." "I see," Chun said, noting the name and making a mental note to research the Veshai Collective more thoroughly later. "Well, Kess, one of the things you'll discover as you gain more experience with these negotiations is that the mathematical formulas serve as starting point for discussions rather than determining final outcomes. The actual allocation process involves many factors that are difficult to quantify mathematically." "Such as?" Kess asked with genuine curiosity. Chen glanced around the group, noting that most of the other beings were indeed beginning to drift away from the conversation. Good. What he needed to do here was better accomplished without an audience. "Well," Chun said, his tone becoming more educational, "there are security considerations, for example. Species with larger defense fleets are often asked to provide protection for extraction operations, which justifies larger allocations. There are technological contributions that go beyond the basic formulas, species that provide unique capabilities or expertise that enable the entire project. And there are administrative efficiencies that come from working with species that have experience managing large-scale industrial operations." Kess nodded thoughtfully. "Those all sound like reasonable factors. But why aren't they included in the official formulas? And why do the diplomatic adjustments always seem to favor the same species?" Chun felt that familiar stirring again, the sensation that came when his diplomatic persona had to work harder to maintain its facade. This young being was not going to be satisfied with standard explanations. "The allocation process is necessarily complex," Chun said, maintaining his patient tone. "The consortium has to balance dozens of different considerations while ensuring that the final agreements are politically sustainable for all participants. Sometimes that means making adjustments that prioritize long-term stability over strict mathematical precision. But who decides what constitutes long-term stability? Kess asked. And why do those decisions consistently result in apex species receiving larger shares than the formulas would suggest they deserve? The question was phrased politely, without accusation or anger, but Chun recognized it for what it was, a direct challenge to the fundamental legitimacy of the consortium allocation system. It was the kind of question that, if asked in the wrong forum or by the wrong being, could undermine decades of carefully constructed diplomatic consensus. Chun looked around and noticed that their conversation was beginning to attract attention from other reception attendees. Several apex species representatives had turned in their direction, and he could see Ambassador Crix approaching with what appeared to be diplomatic concern. Perhaps, Chun said carefully, this is a conversation that would benefit from a more private setting. There are aspects of the negotiation process that are easier to explain without the distractions of a social reception. Kess looked around, apparently noticing for the first time that they had become the center of attention. Oh, yes, that makes sense. What would be convenient for you? Chun consulted his tablet. I have some time tomorrow morning before the negotiation sessions resume. Would you like to meet for breakfast? There's a lovely restaurant in the diplomatic quarter that serves cuisine from dozens of different species. That would be wonderful, Kess said, their enthusiasm apparently genuine. Thank you for taking the time to help me understand these processes better. Of course, Chun replied. It's always a pleasure to work with young beings who are genuinely interested in understanding how interspecies cooperation functions at this level. As Kess moved away to rejoin their delegation, Chun was approached by Ambassador Crix. Her crystalline skin was showing patterns of concerned blue mixed with curious yellow. Ambassador Chun, she said quietly, I couldn't help but notice your conversation with the young Veshai. They seem to be asking some rather pointed questions about resource allocation procedures. Indeed, Chun replied, his expression remaining neutral. An impressive young mind, actually, very mathematically sophisticated for their age. I thought it would be helpful to provide some context about how these negotiations actually function in practice. Crix's skin shifted to a more worried blue. Do you think that's wise? Their questions were making some of the other species' representatives quite uncomfortable. And if they continue asking such direct questions during the official sessions, they might inspire other species to start questioning the frameworks they've already accepted, Chun finished for her. Yes, I had considered that possibility, which is why I think it's important to provide them with a more complete understanding of why the current system functions the way it does. Ah, Crix said, her skin brightening to understanding green. Educational intervention. Help them see the bigger picture so they understand why certain compromises are necessary for the system to function effectively. Exactly, Chun said. Young beings often see these negotiations in terms of abstract, mathematical fairness. But, of course, the real world requires more nuanced approaches to resource management. I'm confident that once Kess understands the practical realities, they'll appreciate why the current frameworks have evolved the way they have. Crix nodded, her skin showing approval. That's very thoughtful of you, Ambassador. I hope the conversation goes well. As Crix moved away, Chun stood alone for a moment, watching the reception flow around him. Beings from dozens of species mixed and mingled, conducting the informal business that often determined the outcomes of formal negotiations. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of diplomacy, with everyone playing their assigned roles. The apex species representatives moved through the crowd like gravitational centers, attracting attention and deference wherever they went. The secondary powers orbited around them, close enough to benefit from the association, but careful not to crowd too closely. The smaller species clustered together in their own groups, occasionally approaching the larger powers, but always maintaining respectful distance. It was a perfect microcosm of galactic politics. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the rules. Everyone participated in the shared fiction that this was a gathering of equals working together for mutual benefit. Everyone except, apparently, one young being who had the audacity to ask why the math didn't add up. Chen finished his drink and began moving toward the exit. He had arrangements to make before his breakfast meeting with Kes tomorrow morning. The conversation would require careful preparation if it was going to serve its intended purpose. He needed to research the HFY collective more thoroughly, understand their specific circumstances and vulnerabilities. He needed to review the mathematical analysis that Kes had mentioned, see exactly what they had discovered and how it could be explained away. And he needed to craft an educational narrative that would help this bright young mind understand why questioning the system was ultimately pointless. It wasn't that Chen enjoyed manipulating idealistic young beings, but someone like Kes, asking the right questions in the wrong forums, could cause significant diplomatic complications. Better to redirect that intellectual curiosity toward more constructive channels than to let it develop into something that might challenge the fundamental structures of consortium governance. After all, those structures existed for good reasons. The galaxy needed stable resource allocation frameworks. It needed predictable power relationships between species. It needed systems that prioritized efficiency and capability over abstract notions of mathematical fairness. The apex species hadn't become apex species by accident. They had earned their positions through superior technology, larger populations, stronger economies, and more effective military forces. The current system simply recognized those realities and channeled them in directions that benefited everyone, even if the benefits weren't distributed equally. Kes would understand that eventually. Most young beings did, once they gained enough experience with the practical realities of interspecies politics. The key was providing the right kind of education at the right time, before their idealism hardened into genuine opposition. Chen made his way back to his quarters, already planning the conversation that would help one curious young mind learn to accept the way things were, and stop asking inconvenient questions about why they couldn't be different. It was just another diplomatic challenge, really. No different from managing trade disputes or territorial negotiations. Just another case of helping someone understand that their initial assumptions about fairness and justice were perhaps a bit too simplistic for the complex realities of galactic governance. Chun had handled dozens of similar situations over the years. This would be no different, although he had to admit Kes was more mathematically sophisticated than most. Their analysis of the allocation discrepancies was actually quite impressive. If circumstances were different, if the young being had been born into one of the apex species, that kind of analytical mind could have been quite valuable in diplomatic service. But circumstances were what they were, and Chen's job was to help Kes understand and accept those circumstances rather than continuing to question them. It was simply the way things worked. The way they had always worked, the way they would continue to work, regardless of what one young being thought about the mathematical fairness of it all. The strong ruled. The weak survived by the grace of the strong. And everyone pretended it was cooperation. Just another day in the life of galactic diplomacy. The restaurant in Nexus Prime's diplomatic quarter was a marvel of interspecies accommodation, with seating areas and atmospheric controls designed to make beings from across the galaxy feel comfortable while dining together. Ambassador Chunwei arrived early for his breakfast meeting with Kes, choosing a table in a section that provided privacy while still offering a view of the station's bustling commercial district through the massive viewport that dominated one wall. Chen had spent most of the previous evening researching the HFY collective, and what he had learned was both illuminating and concerning. The HFY were an ancient species, one of the oldest in their local cluster, but their technological development had been deliberately conservative. They had developed interstellar travel centuries ago, but had chosen to expand slowly, maintaining small, sustainable colonies rather than pursuing the kind of aggressive expansion that characterized the apex species. Their homeworld of HFY Prime was described in consortium records as a garden world, with carefully maintained ecological balance and sustainable population levels that had remained virtually unchanged for over 1,000 years. They had no significant military forces, no industrial complexes, no vast mining operations, or colonial empires. What they did have was an educational system that apparently produced beings capable of sophisticated mathematical and logical analysis, as evidenced by young Kess's ability to deconstruct consortium allocation formulas in their spare time. Chun was reviewing his notes when Kess arrived, looking around the restaurant with the same wide-eyed curiosity they had shown at the reception. The young being was even smaller than Chun had initially thought, probably no more than a meter tall, with soft brown fur and large eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. "Ambassador Chun," Kess said as they approached the table, "thank you again for making time for this conversation. This place is incredible. I've never seen so many different species dining together peacefully." Chun rose and gestured to the chair across from him, which had been adjusted to accommodate Kess's smaller stature. "Please sit. And yes, Nexus Prime is quite remarkable in that regard. It's one of the great successes of interspecies cooperation." As Kess settled into their chair, Chin signaled for a server. The being that approached was a consortium service synthetic designed to interact comfortably with any known species. "What can I provide for you this morning?" it asked in perfectly modulated galactic standard. "I'll have a standard diplomatic breakfast," Chin said. "Ambassador Kess, the menu here can accommodate virtually any nutritional requirements." Kess consulted the menu display with obvious fascination. "These options are amazing. I'll try the grain porridge with cultivated protein, please. And perhaps some of that fruit juice blend." After the server left, Chin settled back in his chair and studied his young breakfast companion. Up close, he could see that Kess carried a small tablet similar to his own, though theirs appeared to be loaded with mathematical software rather than diplomatic documents. "So," Chin said with his most approachable smile, "tell me about the Veshai Collective. I'm afraid your species isn't as well represented in consortium affairs as perhaps it should be." Kess's ears perked up with apparent pleasure. "We're a fairly small species by galactic standards. Only about 2 billion of us across 12 worlds. We prefer sustainable development to rapid expansion. My people tend to be cautious about major changes." "A wise approach," Chin said diplomatically. "Sustainable development is becoming increasingly important in consortium policy, though I imagine it must be challenging to maintain that approach when dealing with species that prioritize rapid growth and resource acquisition." "That's actually part of what I've been trying to understand," Kess said, leaning forward with obvious interest. "The consortium's stated mission is to promote sustainable, cooperative development that benefits all member species. But when I look at the actual resource allocation patterns, they seem to consistently favor species that pursue aggressive expansion rather than sustainable practices." Chin nodded thoughtfully. "It's an interesting observation, though I think you might be seeing the effects rather than the causes. Species that pursue aggressive expansion often develop the technological and industrial capabilities that make them valuable partners in major development projects. Their larger allocations reflect their larger contributions to the overall effort." Kess tilted their head in a gesture that Chun read as polite skepticism. "But that creates a circular logic problem, doesn't it? If only species with aggressive expansion policies can develop the capabilities needed to be valuable partners, then the allocation system inherently rewards expansion and punishes sustainability, which contradicts the consortium's stated values." Their breakfast arrived before Chun could respond, giving him a moment to consider his approach. Kess's analysis was logically sound and difficult to refute directly. He would need to guide the conversation toward practical realities rather than abstract principles. "You raise a valid point about circular logic," Chun said as they began eating. "But consider the practical alternatives. The Andromeda sector development represents one of the largest resource extraction efforts in galactic history. It requires massive industrial capability, advanced extraction technology, and sophisticated logistics coordination. Only a few species currently possess those capabilities. The apex species, Kess said. Exactly. Now, we could theoretically distribute the resources equally among all interested species, regardless of their ability to contribute to the extraction effort. But what would be the practical result? Kess considered this while taking a bite of their porridge. Smaller species would receive allocations they couldn't effectively utilize without technological assistance. Right. And where would that assistance come from? The apex species, Kess said again, beginning to see where Chen's argument was leading. So we would end up with the same species doing the actual work, but now they would be providing their capabilities as paid services rather than as direct participants. The smaller species would receive their allocations, pay most of their value to apex species contractors, and end up with a much smaller net benefit than they would receive under the current partnership framework. Chen could see Kess processing this logic, their expression thoughtful. It was a good argument because it was largely true. The reality was that most smaller species lack the industrial base to effectively exploit major resource deposits on their own. That's assuming the current technological disparities are permanent, Kess said eventually. But what if the consortium invested in developing the capabilities of smaller species rather than reinforcing the advantages of species that are already technologically advanced? Chen paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. It was an insightful counterargument, and one that exposed some of the fundamental assumptions underlying consortium resource policy. Technology transfer programs do exist, Chen said carefully. The Human Colonial Administration, for example, provides technical assistance to dozens of smaller species. But developing advanced industrial capabilities requires enormous investments of time and resources. Most species simply can't afford the costs involved, can't afford them, or aren't offered reasonable financing terms? Kess asked. I've been reviewing the loan structures for consortium development programs. The interest rates and repayment terms effectively ensure that borrowing species become economically dependent on their creditors rather than developing genuine independence. Chun felt that familiar cold stirring in his chest. Kess had apparently done far more research into consortium economic structures than their age and apparent inexperience would suggest. They were asking exactly the kinds of questions that the system was designed to discourage. Economic development is complex, Chen said, falling back on diplomatic generalities. The lending terms reflect the real risks involved in developing untested industrial capabilities. Default rates for technology development loans are quite high, particularly among species that lack experience with large-scale industrial projects. But the default rates are calculated based on market interest rates that are set by apex species financial institutions, Kess pointed out, which creates another circular logic problem. Apex species set the economic terms that smaller species must meet to access development funding. Then, point to the failure to meet those terms as justification for maintaining the existing economic disparities. Chen set down his fork and looked directly at Kess. The young being was systematically deconstructing the logical foundations of consortium economic policy with the kind of methodical precision that Chen usually associated with much older and more experienced analysts. Kess, he said gently, you're clearly a very intelligent being with impressive analytical capabilities. But I think you may be approaching these issues from a perspective that doesn't fully account for the historical realities that shaped current structures. What do you mean? Chen leaned back in his chair and adopted the patient tone he used when explaining complex political realities to junior diplomats. The consortium wasn't created in a vacuum. It emerged from centuries of interspecies conflict, resource wars, and competitive expansion. The current frameworks weren't designed according to abstract principles of mathematical fairness. They were developed through practical experience with what actually works to maintain peace and stability among species with very different capabilities and interests. Kess nodded politely, but Chen could see they weren't entirely convinced. I understand that historical factors matter, but surely the goal should be to gradually reform systems that perpetuate inequality, not to accept them as permanent features of interspecies relations. Reform is certainly possible, Chun agreed, but it has to be approached carefully. Rapid changes to established systems can create instability that ultimately harms everyone, particularly the smaller species that benefit from the current peace. Chun paused and looked out the viewport at the busy commercial district beyond. Ships from dozens of different species moved through the traffic patterns with synchronized precision, their movements coordinated by station control systems that managed millions of individual transactions every day. "Look out there," he said, gesturing toward the window. "What do you see?" Kess turned to follow his gaze. "Ships, trade routes, commercial activity." "Exactly. Peaceful commerce between species that were at war with each other within living memory. Beings from dozens of different worlds working together, trading freely, sharing technology and culture. That peace exists because the current system provides predictable frameworks for interspecies interaction." Chun turned back to face Kess directly. "Now, imagine what might happen if smaller species suddenly decided that the mathematical fairness of resource allocation was more important than maintaining the stability that enables all of this cooperation. Imagine if they began demanding immediate redistribution of existing arrangements, or refused to participate in negotiations because they considered the frameworks inherently biased." Kess was quiet for a long moment, their large eyes reflecting what appeared to be genuine consideration of Chen's argument. "You're suggesting that questioning the system could destabilize the peace." "I'm suggesting that the system, whatever its imperfections, has produced the most peaceful and prosperous era in galactic history, and that beings who care about the welfare of smaller species should be very cautious about proposing changes that might undermine that achievement." "But what about species that are suffering under the current system?" Kess asked. "What about worlds that have been strip-mined by apex species corporations? What about colonies that have been displaced to make room for resource extraction? What about species that have become economically dependent because they were never given genuine opportunities to develop their own capabilities?" Chun felt a flash of something that might have been irritation, or perhaps respect for Kess's persistence. The young being wasn't accepting his carefully constructed arguments as readily as most beings did. "Those are legitimate concerns," he said, "and the consortium has mechanisms for addressing them. Compensation frameworks for displaced populations, environmental protection standards for resource extraction, economic assistance programs for species that need development support. The system isn't perfect, but it does provide recourse for addressing problems when they arise. Recourse that is administered by the same apex species that create the problems in the first place," Kess said quietly. Chun stared at the young being across from him, feeling the conversation shift into territory that was genuinely dangerous. Kess wasn't just questioning specific policies or arrangements. They were questioning the fundamental legitimacy of apex species authority within the consortium framework. "Kess," Chin said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I appreciate your passion for justice and equality. They're admirable qualities. But I think you may be underestimating the complexities involved in governing a galactic civilization with hundreds of different species, each with their own interests and capabilities." "I'm not underestimating the complexity," Kess replied. "I'm questioning whether the current approach to managing that complexity is really the best possible approach, or just the approach that benefits the species who are strong enough to impose it on everyone else." Chun felt the mask slipping just slightly. Behind his diplomatic smile, something colder and more calculating was stirring to life. This young being was not going to be redirected with patient explanations and historical context. They had clearly thought through their position carefully and were not interested in accepting convenient justifications for inconvenient realities, which meant that a different approach was required. "Tell me," Chan said, his tone becoming more conversational, "what do you think would happen if the Veshai Collective decided to withdraw from the consortium? If your people announced that they were no longer willing to participate in negotiations that they considered fundamentally unfair?" Kess blinked in apparent surprise. That's not what I was suggesting. I was talking about reform within the existing framework, not withdrawal from the consortium. But if the framework is as systematically biased as you believe, why would you expect reform efforts to succeed? Why would apex species voluntarily give up advantages that they've spent centuries building just because smaller species ask them to? Chen could see uncertainty flickering in Kess's eyes for the first time since the conversation had started. Good. Time to press the advantage. The Veshai Collective has 12 worlds and a population of 2 billion. Chun continued, his tone remaining conversational, but his words carrying an unmistakable edge. No significant military forces. No major industrial capacity. No strategic resources that other species couldn't obtain elsewhere. If you withdrew from the consortium, how long do you think it would be before one of your neighboring species decided that your garden worlds would make excellent agricultural colonies? The consortium has mutual defense agreements, Kess said, but their voice carried less certainty than before. Defense agreements that are enforced by apex species military forces, Chun pointed out. Forces that would presumably no longer be obligated to protect worlds that had withdrawn from consortium membership. Chun leaned forward slightly, his diplomatic smile never wavering. I'm not threatening you, Kess. I'm simply pointing out the practical realities that shaped the current system. The consortium exists because smaller species need the protection and economic opportunities that come from association with apex powers. And apex species participate because the system gives them predictable frameworks for